Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Dev Diary. This month we'll be working on a small two-part holiday themed project. Now, a few holiday specials ago, I made and released a game called the Peppermint Gauntlet. It was one of my first attempts at a first-person Doom-like 3D shooter made in GameMaker 1.4. Well, I wanted to revisit that world in order to test a few things that may or may not evolve into something more in the future. But before we get into anything, if you enjoyed this video, remember to leave a like. Be sure to also subscribe if you're new to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss part 2. And with that said, let's talk plans. The plan is simple. Create a very basic 2D top-down arena shooter featuring a few enemy variations, gun types, and a couple other features. Nothing fancy, just some good old code running a good old top-down shooter with an emphasis on the gameplay, because future implications. Anyway, let's go over some global elements first. There are a few functions that shorthand a lot of built-in GameMaker functions. I imagine that this is ultimately inefficient from a performance standpoint, but boy does it make using some of the functions easier. Anyway, we've also got the nearest not me check used in a few projects now, as well as a couple bounce functions which are exactly the same ones that were used in my Curse Ball remake. The next two constructors are basically glossaries for weapon and ammo types. If you'd like a better rundown of how they'll be used, check out my recent Let's Dev about inventories. And that's about it for our global elements, so let's move on to the controller. Our first two functions handle our projectile object pooling. The set weapon function, well, sets a weapon for the target object. The throw weapon function will trigger the target weapon to be thrown. The reset weapon function is used to completely remove any ownership ties to the target weapon. And the shoot weapon, well, obviously triggers the weapon to shoot. Weapon ammo is consumed and a projectile is set based on switch cases. Pistols, revolvers, and SMGs are all basic bullets. Shotguns use slugs. Grenade launchers use grenades. RPGs use rockets. Lasers use lasers. Railguns use Mega Laser Rail Blaster Extreme 3000. Seeker uses homing arrows. Random is random. And goo uses goo. Projectile behaviors will be explained in due time, but for now let's move on. A general damage function is used for all units in play. The player and all enemies have the same main parent object, which allows us to use a universal damage function to check for and damage characters, which is typical damage behavior that we use in every project. The next two functions are also damage functions using similar checks as the previous damage function, only this time using collision geometry. And the last two functions are general use hurt checks for projectiles and geometry, basically checks for friendly fire and the like. And that's it for control functions, so let's move on to the ticker. The heart of our projects these days, the ticker is used to control just about everything that happens in our game. Starting with the enemy spawner, an array is used to mark where an enemy will spawn. This array is then cycled through, slowly counting down towards the enemy's actual spawn. Once the timer for that entry runs out, the enemy is spawned and the entry is deleted from the array. And currently the spawner will choose from 3 different enemy types. And next are the behaviors for all these instances. First, our general parent object, which again is used by the player and the enemy. For now, it simply keeps track of the hurt timer for all actors, aka their invincibility frames. Now with that out of the way, let's get to specifics with the player in all its control and behavioral glory. First, the move check and aim direction are defined. Next, we have the movement code, and depending on the state, the player will move at full or half speed, which also sets a moving state to true. Now, the player has 2 major states, normal and what I'm currently calling ghost state. During the normal state, the player can fire their weapon with left click, which requires ammo. They can also throw their weapon with the right click. Pressing E while next to an unowned weapon will allow the player to either swap or grab said weapon depending on their current weapon status. And finally, spacebar will transition the player into quote-unquote ghost mode, forcing them to drop their weapon. And finally, while in their normal state, if the player comes in contact with a pickup, aka health or ammo, the necessary checks are made and the player is replenished with either health or ammo. As for the ghost state, the only thing the player can really do right now is exit the ghost state again by pressing the spacebar. And our player's code is rounded out with the settings of sprites based on status, clamps, and cooldown timers. Whew, and that was just the player. Now let's move on to the weapon objects. First, if a weapon is thrown, said weapon begins moving in said direction at an ever-slowing speed. It also rotates while airborne. While in the throw state, if the weapon comes in contact with the player or an enemy, the bounce function is applied, sending the weapon flying in a random direction. The same checks are then applied to the edges of the screen, which will also send the thrown weapon back the way it came. And once thrown time is over, the weapon is completely reset to a neutral state. And when not being thrown, if it's currently held by someone or something, it is then attached to that someone or something until further action is taken. Now that's our weapon behavior code. Next up is an instance that rivals the player's code in length, the projectile behavior code. Regular bullets are standard and move at a consistent pace throughout their lifetime. Shotgun slugs, however, slow down over time. Grenades also slow down over time, but instead of removing themselves after their lifetime ends, the grenade switches to its explosion state. Although it should also be noted that getting smacked by a grenade will also still do some physical damage. Rockets are similar to grenades, only instead of slowing down, rockets speed up over time. The laser is about what you'd expect from a laser. It uses a collision line to deal damage, making it one of the more precise projectiles. However, it does have infinite piercing to balance it out. The railgun is similar to the laser in behavior, however, it uses an extended sprite instead of a collision line for damage. It's also the strongest projectile in the game, which is balanced by having a really long wind-up time and very small magazine. Also note that both the laser and railgun are two of the only projectiles that don't actually move and are stuck to the weapon that they are fired from. The Seeker Bolt is a homing projectile, so it searches out the nearest enemy to its position and hones in on their location. And finally, we have the Goo projectile. It moves like a standard bullet, however, it will bounce off walls, and if it comes in contact with an enemy, it will stick to that enemy, dealing damage to it over its lifetime. And fun fact, this uses the same sticky system used for lasers, but obviously to stick to enemies. The ticker then does some basic collision detection with conditionals for special ammo. This is where explosives are triggered and goo is stuck to enemies. Following that is basic movement for all projectiles and what to do when projectiles leave the play area. Now there's more to cover, however we'll save it for next episode. But before we wrap it up, let's talk about the graphics for a second. Throughout the code showcased today, you may have noticed speeds and scaling have a modifier applied to their values. For this project, I wanted to test a way to handle visual scaling. So the code was originally written for a 640 by 360 display size, but it's now currently scaled by 2, meaning everything behaves as if the display is 1280 by 720. What I'm hoping to accomplish by developing this system means that I can easily scale visuals with the gameplay without having to rewrite/recalculate speeds and scale values by hand. So theoretically, the same code can be used to display tiny 8-bit graphics and 4K high-res art with one simple tweak to the scale value. Now pushing it to those limits has not been attempted yet, but it's one of the many things that I'm hoping to experiment with under the hood. So far it seems to be working as expected, so hopefully it stays that way. So yeah, I'd love to know what you think of the scaling system or really anything showcased today. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And quick reminder, if you enjoy these videos and would like to support the channel, I am now on Patreon. But with that said, thank you so much for watching and I'll see you guys next time.